And now for our last conversation this evening is the first Democrat to throw his hat into the ring as a candidate for the 2020 presidential election, Congressman John Delaney of Maryland. Like the other lawmakers who are with us this evening, Congressman Delaney is recognized for his bipartisan leadership in today's Congress. Thank you for being here, Congressman.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Last time, Congressman, you were at our events, I asked you if you're going to run for governor of Maryland.
I didn't lie to you.
No, you didn't. You didn't. But now you're running for president.
I am.
Why?
So I think the central question facing this country, more than any particular piece of policy, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about policy and ideas, is how do we take this terribly divided nation where American has been pitted against American and start bringing it back together again around this notion of kind of unity and common purpose, which has forever been kind of the beating heart of who we are as a nation. And I'm running for president to do that because I think it's incredibly important, not only because it'll make us feel better, not only because we need it to be resilient, but because we actually need it to start getting things done. I mean, the world's changed tremendously over the last several decades. Technological innovation, automation, globalization, these have been utterly transformative to every aspect of our society. And we have failed to do the basic things we should have done as a country to update our people for this world. And so many of them are being left behind, and we're not kind of asserting the leadership we need to do globally. And I think it's all because we're so deeply divided.
You have been on the campaign trail a lot. You're the first major presidential candidate in the race. You've been to Iowa a lot.
Yes.
What are you hearing from constituents there, people there?
You know, I'm hearing what I just said. I mean, it's been very much a reaffirming process for me because most Americans, you know, are struggling to get through the day. You know, about half of this country, according to the Federal Reserve, can't afford a $500 surprise expense. Mm-hmm. You know, they wake up and something happens to their car, or their house, or their health care, and it's $500, they're completely derailed. They don't have the savings, they don't have the capacity in their credit cards. And so, you know, the American people want solutions. They want us to get things done. I think they're shocked at what's happened in Washington and how dysfunctional and corrupt in many ways we've become, and how we have our elected officials don't appear to be doing things for them, but doing things for themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a tremendous amount of anger, obviously, and they want solutions.
There are going to be many Democrats who run for president.
You don't think I've cleared the field?
Yeah, not yet. One possible candidate has been in the news again this week is Michael Avenatti, and he has said the Democrats need a fighter. They need to get down and dirty with President Trump, and there are others in the Democratic Party who feel that. Do you think that's the wrong approach?
No, I don't think it's wrong. I mean, we obviously have to fight for what we believe in, mm-hmm. but what we really have to do is win elections. I mean, the central issue facing the Democratic Party is we've lost all these elections. I mean, we've lost the House, we've lost the Senate, we've lost the White House, we've lost 2/3 of the governorships, and we've lost 1,000 legislative seats in this country across the last 8 years. So the problem with the Democratic Party is not that we're not fighting hard enough. I mean, I have the privilege of serving under Nancy Pelosi, who I think is the single toughest person I've ever seen in terms of her determination and strength. We have plenty of tough fighters. What we have put ourselves is in a really bad position. And so we need to win elections. And to me, the best way for us to win elections is really simple, to be a Big Ten party. If we can be the kind of party that is welcoming of progressives who want change, centrists who kind of want solutions, independents who just want their elected officials to put their country ahead of their political party, and disaffected Republicans who are looking at the White House and the president and saying, that's not my party. Mm-hmm. If we can build that coalition, we're going to win every election. So I'm focused on winning because you need to win to govern and to get some of these things done. So of course we need to be strong and tough and stand up for our values. Absolutely, we got to throw a punch when someone throws a punch at us. But we also have to build a coalition. Because if we keep slicing the country up and creating all these divisions, not only is it bad for the people, but it's bad for our chances of winning. So
along those lines, and talking about 2016 in particular,
yeah.
Why did Hillary Clinton lose? Was it just because we're looking at some states and she wasn't visiting the so-called flyover states? I mean, what were the lessons learned going forward so the Democrats don't lose again?
So obviously none of us know why she lost, because we don't know the counterfactuals, right? But obviously we didn't have the turnout we should have had. Mm-hmm. So 2016 we didn't excite Democrats enough. And also I think we lost the middle. I mean, to me it's really simple. Like, we have this big debate in the Democratic Party between turnout and persuasion. The answer is both. Mm-hmm. We need big ideas built on a foundation of kind of things that make sense and can get done. And we need to stand for something. And I think in 2016, there was a real rejection of the political, there was a lot of anger and a rejection of the political system. And I think obviously the president spoke to that in a way that captured people's attention. And Secretary Clinton didn't do that enough. I mean, but there were a lot of forces that played into this election. None of us really know why. It almost doesn't matter. And that's how I think about it, which is, we spend all our time talking about that. I'd rather spend my time focusing on what do we need to do to win in 2018 and win in 2020.
There was a lot of criticism of the Democratic National Committee of how it ran the primary in 2016. Yes. There are, I think, are likely, I was counting them, probably 24 Democrats, maybe more, major candidates, members of Congress like yourself, governors, mayors. How is DNC going to run this and be fair about it, especially when you think about the debates? I mean, the Republicans had a problem. They had 16 or 17. Yeah. There's going to be more candidates than that.
There will be, and we've had that in the past. The best analogy to this election, I think, was 1976, when we had Watergate, mm-hmm. which was a terrible scar on the American people. Mm-hmm. And the Democratic primary had 19 people in it, mm-hmm. because the sense was after Watergate, the Democrats were going to win. It was a huge field. And Jimmy Carter emerged from that field because he answered the central question of the day. The central question back in 1976 was, how do you restore trust in a corrupt government? And Jimmy Carter, the very honest, peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, who pretty much everyone in this room wasn't born when he was president, really answered that question. And I do think these elections are about who answers that question. So it's going to be a really big field, which I think is great. We should have a big debate. I think some of these political organizations are a little outdated. I mean, I personally think the DNC should move out of Washington and plop itself down in the middle of the country and be focused on actually party building everywhere in this country and not serve the elected officials. We don't need the DNC to serve us. What the DNC should be doing is focused on building organizations at the local level and supporting people who want to do that. And then their formal job is actually to have the debates and organize the convention, right? So we need to keep the DNC focused on its role. But I think these organizations, again, are a little outdated. If you think about some of the great movements that have happened in this country since the president's been elected, the Women's March, the March for Our Lives, all these things, if the DNC tried to organize these things, like 1/100th of the people would have showed up to them, mm-hmm. right? Is it not working? Yeah. Got it. We're in such an amazingly connected world, and this is how people want to organize themselves. And so I think any political organization has to be understanding of that and really understand what its role is, which is to support organizations, not to put its thumb on the scales, right? And not to try to play kingmaker, but to support the building of democratic organizations at the local level. And then when the elections occur on the presidential level, the DNC is supposed to organize the debates, and they are supposed to organize the convention. That's like a very specific job.
Right, right. We're going to open up for questions in a couple. I don't know. We'll open it up now because we got a lot of questions. And if you can keep your question short and.
Hi.
I was just wondering. I know everyone talks about I want to make these. You would be very content having these if you felt like being successful.
Sure. That's actually a really great question. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of issues in this country where the American people really have tremendous kind of broad support for. Building infrastructure, reforming our broken criminal justice system, common sense gun safety measures, having a national artificial intelligence strategy, doing things to protect our digital privacy, certain reforms like gerrymandering, these kind of things. There's a huge long list of issues, fixing healthcare, improving healthcare, that enjoy tremendous bipartisan support, but they haven't had leadership. And one of the things I've called on as president is that in my first 100 days, I will only advance ideas that already have bipartisan support in the Congress, right? Again, and it's some of the ideas I just talked about. Infrastructure, criminal justice reform. There are bipartisan bills right now in the Congress that good-minded Democrats and Republicans have been working on for years. I had an infrastructure bill that had 40 Democrats, 40 Republicans to invest $1 trillion in infrastructure. It had the head of the Freedom Caucus, which is the most conservative caucus in the Congress, and the head of the Progressive Caucus, which is the most progressive. But these things never really get acted upon. What we tend to do is have a partisan agenda out of the blocks. And I think it would be amazing if a president stood in front of the American people and say, listen, I represent every one of you, whether you voted for me or not. It's a sacred stewardship that I've now been given the privilege of having. And to prove this point to you, in my first 100 days, I'm just going to work on these things that your representatives on both sides of the aisle have found common ground on. And so that would be my initial agenda. And I think things like infrastructure, criminal justice reform, you know, and some other things really kind of float hot. National service is another thing I've really focused on, which is creating, not mandatory, but creating more opportunities for kids who graduate from high school to serve their country, either military, community service, or infrastructure, rebuilding our parks, et cetera. Stuff like that enjoyed tremendous bipartisan support.
We have microphone disease going on.
Hard time.
Right here.
A couple of these issues you already mentioned, but as far as if you do run the Democratic Parties had problems capitalizing on downstream ballots,
yes,
gerrymandering, the financial longevity of the party, gerrymandering of the issues of getting justices on the courts. So my question is, with all this in mind, what's your long-term strategy past 2020 for the party?
Well, part of it is actually having a long-term strategy, because I don't think the Democratic Party has had that, and it's a really great question. I mean, to some extent, the Democratic Party, which I love, we have been very short-sighted, and we actually forgot how the government was organized in some ways. States have tremendous power in this country, and that was the foundational deal, how this country was organized, right? You had 13 independent colonies. They were really like 13 different countries. You know, in Virginia, they bowed, they didn't shake hands. In Massachusetts, they shook hands. New Jersey and Pennsylvania had a trade agreement between themselves. I mean, for them to come together and form this union, they created a system that empowered the states. And the Senate is the great example of that. And so, and if you, oh my gosh, sorry about that.
Head of DNC.
One of my 4 daughters. And so we have to realize that's why when I look at the map, it is so discouraging to me, and I see blue on the coast and red in the middle of the country, because we need a plan to campaign everywhere and build an organization everywhere. And I think at this moment in time, when so many Americans are concerned about how the norms in our society are being degraded and our leadership around the world is being reduced, we have a unique opportunity to talk to people who haven't been listening to us for a long time. I'm an entrepreneur by background. Prior to running for Congress, I started 2 businesses. I took them public. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. So I was actually an entrepreneur by background. So strategy has always been really important to me. So embedded in your question was kind of the answer, which is the way we have to first start by having a long-term strategy. And that's one of the things the Republicans actually did really well. They figured out sooner than we did that if you control the states, you control the federal government. And they've controlled most of the state legislatures and governorships, which has given them the ability to gerrymander. And I mean, when I was elected to Congress for the first time in 2012, on an aggregate basis, 4% more Americans voted for the Democrat members of Congress, if you will, than the Republicans. Yet I came into a House of Representatives with a 22-person deficit. This is a terribly gerrymandered country right now, and it's bent the will of our democracy, and we no longer have representative democracy because of it. We have to not only kind of try to do our best to get rid of gerrymandering, but we really have to take back the states.
Time for one more question. You choose.
Well, I'm going to pick both. And I'll let them both ask their questions, and then I'll answer them quicker than I did my last. I apologize.
If and when the Democratic Party does win in 2018 and 2020, what does that party stand for?
I think it stands for Oh, sorry. I think it stands for the future, right? Thinking about where the world is going and doing the kind of things we need to do to prepare our citizens and the country for the future. Because I think our fundamental responsibility is to make the world more prosperous, more just, and more secure for our citizens. And we can't be the party of turning back the clock, because I think that's what the president's agenda is. We have to be the party of the future.
The role of this is leadership and action, and I'm curious about your thoughts on what the role of media is in not being the loudest person in the room, because it tends to be more, tends to corrupt the message.
Yes.
Right? And so how do we utilize the media to take away from being the loudest voice to bringing bipartisanship and doing the dirty things
Yes.
that maybe are being done behind closed doors that aren't being recognized?
Well, it's a great question, because the media has changed tremendously, obviously, over the last couple of decades, and the last several years in particular. And I think both the media and the American people have had a hard time getting their head around it. I mean, Walter Cronkite said, again, someone else before your time, he said the role of the journalist is not to tell the American people what they want to hear, but it's to tell them what they need to know. And I think the media really needs to reset its compass a little bit around that, because there's an inherent conflict. And my oldest daughter's a journalist, and I'm incredibly proud of her for it. And so I'm a huge supporter of the free and independent press. But there is a conflict in the media between the bottom line and doing your fundamental job as journalists. And I think to some extent the print paper has done a very good job in the last several years balancing that. I think cable news has had a harder time with it. Let's put it that way. And so I just think there needs to be, one of the things I've actually called for as part of my presidential campaign to counter that a little bit is to almost go back to more old-fashioned public square debating. So for example, I've said that the president should debate the Congress once every 3 months on national television for 3 hours. Everyone would watch it.
Definitely.
Right?
Definitely, yes.
And
yes.
everyone would watch it.
Right.
And the first hour and a half could be a particular issue, healthcare, education, foreign policy, whatever the case may be, something really important. And the other hour and a half can be questions. There's something in Great Britain. Yeah, question time.
Yeah.
And so I just think it would be transformative. I really do, because I think the American people are having a hard time with the truth. Right? You all, particularly students in the world, you're taught to widen your aperture as a learner, to think about different ideas, you know, challenge yourself. But unfortunately, a lot of the American people increasingly have narrowed their aperture over the last several years and get their information from increasingly kind of reinforcing sources. And we need to break out of that, because those sources are doing something really insidious, which kind of telling the American people that half the country is entirely wrong about everything they believe. And we all know that's not true. You know, no matter how strong of a partisan you are, we all know you have friends and neighbors and people you work with or go to church with, whatever the case may be, or go to school with, who are in a different party, but you think they're great and they're smart and they have good ideas. And so we need to break that a little bit, and you know, I think we need to do some out-of-the-box things. And I think the media will come along, I really do. I think they've had as hard a time with it as the American people have to some extent.
We're out of time. Please thank the Congressman.
Thank you.
And I hand it back to Jack. Thank you.